What happens when a wealthy tycoon weds a lowly street dweller on a dare, only to uncover a stunning secret on their wedding night? Let's dive into this gripping tale. But first, drop a wow in the comments below and hit that like button if you're ready for an emotional roller coaster. Enjoy the story. James Carter, a cold and confident millionaire, radiated arrogance as he stood on the balcony of a lavish party. Nothing seemed to faze his demeanor until an old friend, Ethan Brooks, approached with a glass of wine in hand and a provocative smile. "James, you're always saying money can buy anything, right?" Ethan said, breaking the silence. James took a sip of his champagne, his expression indifferent. "Because it can." Ethan leaned against the balcony railing and pointed toward a figure sitting on the sidewalk below. A young woman, barefoot, wearing worn-out clothes, with a weary gaze. "See her?" Ethan said, his tone challenging. "She's your next challenge. I bet $2 million you can't turn her into a high-society lady and stay married to her for 3 months. James narrowed his eyes, locking onto the young woman. For a moment, he didn't see a person, just a pawn in a game he was confident he could win. $2 million? He asked, a cynical smile forming. "You clearly underestimate my abilities, Ethan." "Let's see then." Ethan raised his glass in a toast, his look daring. James remained silent, staring at the scene below. The young woman seemed entirely oblivious to the world around her, a small plastic cup at her side where a few coins clinked occasionally. "Looks like tonight's entertainment has begun," James murmured before turning and heading back inside. Minutes later, he was on the sidewalk, just steps away from the young woman. As he approached, her hunched figure under the dim yellow glow of a streetlight became clearer. Her disheveled hair framed a face marked by exhaustion, yet carried a silent strength that intrigued him. Her thin hands held a piece of cardboard with crooked writing. "Anything helps." Excuse me," James said, his tone more of a command than a request. The woman looked up, startled. Her blue eyes, dulled by hardship, revealed a latent strength James hadn't expected. "What do you want?" she asked wearily, shrinking further into herself. James offered a smile that blended condescension and curiosity. "I have a proposition for you, something that could change your life." She frowned, suspicious, but said nothing. "I'm serious," he continued, kneeling to meet her eye level. "My name is Carter. I have money, a lot of it, and I need someone like you for a personal project." "Project?" she replied bitterly, laughing softly. Her worn teeth showed as she spoke. "I'm not anyone's guinea pig, Mr. Millionaire." James ignored her sharp tone and pressed on with cold precision. "I'm willing to pay generously. You'll have food, clothes, a place to stay. All you need to do is marry me for 3 months." The woman blinked, incredulous. "You must be joking." "I don't joke about business," James replied firmly. "It's simple. A marriage of convenience, no real commitment. After 3 months, we part ways, and you walk away with more money than you've ever imagined." She sat in silence for a few moments, processing the absurd proposal. Her life had been a string of downward spirals since losing everything, yet something about James's authoritative tone irritated her deeply. "Why me?" she finally asked. "Because you're here," he replied bluntly. James's cynical response nearly made her stand and walk away, but the weight of hunger and cold kept her rooted in place. "My name is Sophia Lane," she said softly. "And if I agree, how do I know this isn't some sort of scam?" James pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Moments later, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. A sharply dressed driver stepped out and opened the back door. "Get in," James ordered. "We'll talk somewhere more comfortable." Sophia hesitated, but the temptation to escape the street, even for a few hours, was too strong. She climbed into the car, and James followed, instructing the driver to take them to the nearest hotel. The silence during the ride was almost unbearable. Sophia watched the city pass by through the window, while James indifferently typed something on his phone. When they arrived at the hotel, they were escorted to a luxurious suite. Sophia could barely hide her astonishment. Plush carpets, refined wooden furniture, and a stunning view of the city created a scene she never could have imagined. James ordered room service to bring food and clean clothes. Sophia, still wary, stayed near the door, watching his every move. "Relax," James said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "I have no interest in hurting you. This is just part of a deal." A few minutes later, the food arrived. Sophia ate without hesitation, feeling her stomach finally settle. James observed her intently, analyzing her every gesture. "So, do you agree or not?" he asked once she finished eating. Sophia wiped her mouth with a napkin and took a deep breath. "How much are you paying me?" $1 million, James replied, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Sophia nearly choked. The amount seemed unreal. With that kind of money, she could start over, maybe even help others like her. But the thought of compromising her dignity was unsettling. "I need some guarantees," she said, trying to regain control of the conversation. James nodded. "Everything will be in writing. My lawyer will draft a contract. You'll have food, clothes, and a room at my mansion." "And the wedding?" she asked hesitantly. "Tomorrow," James replied bluntly. "It'll be quick, just a formality." Sophia ran her hand through her hair, feeling cornered. James's words sounded final, leaving no room for negotiation. At last, she sighed and nodded. "All right." James stood, satisfied. "Excellent. Rest tonight. Tomorrow marks the first day of the rest of our lives." Sophia watched him leave the suite, leaving her alone in the luxurious room. The silence that followed was almost deafening. She knew she had made a risky decision, but at the same time, she felt like she had no other choice. The next morning, Sophia was awakened by a soft knock on the door. The hotel housekeeper entered with a breakfast tray and neatly folded new clothes. Sophia noticed the care in every detail: fine fabrics, neutral colors, all perfectly tailored to her size. As she ate, the weight of her decision sank in. She was selling 3 months of her life, but the promise of $1 million made her head spin. Starting over no longer felt like a distant dream. Shortly after, James appeared, as polished as ever, holding a leather folder. He handed it to Sophia. "Here's the contract. Read it, sign it, and we'll meet at the courthouse at 2 o'clock." Sophia flipped through the document. Her eyes scanned clauses and terms, outlining every detail of the agreement. Everything seemed legitimate, but the formality felt unsettling. Still, she signed, feeling like each stroke of the pen marked a point of no return. The wedding was quick and emotionless. Just a few words exchanged in front of an impersonal judge, a few signatures, and it was done. Sophia Lane was now officially Sophia Carter, James Carter's wife. There were no guests, just the driver and the lawyer as witnesses. As they left the courthouse, James placed a hand on the small of Sophia's back, guiding her to the car. She noticed he did it not with affection, but with mechanical precision, as if fulfilling a protocol. "And now?" Sophia asked as the car moved through the busy streets. "Now we go to my mansion." "That's where you'll be staying for the next few months?" James said without looking up from his phone. The Carter mansion was as grand as Sophia had imagined. Tall, wrought-iron gates opened automatically, revealing a long driveway lined with perfectly manicured gardens. The house itself was massive, with white columns and large windows reflecting the sky. Inside, Sophia was greeted by a team of staff. James gave quick instructions, telling them to prepare a room for his new wife. Meanwhile, Sophia remained silent, trying to take in her surroundings. By nightfall, James invited her to dinner. The dining room was enormous, with a long table illuminated by a crystal chandelier. Sophia sat at one end, James at the other. The distance between them felt symbolic, but James, indifferent, simply began eating. "How are you settling in?" he asked in an almost casual tone. "I'm not used to this much luxury," Sophia admitted, glancing around. James allowed a faint smile. "You'll get used to it." After dinner, James walked Sophia to the room prepared for her. In the hallway, their voices echoed softly until Sophia stopped and turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, finally voicing the question that had been haunting her. James crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "Because I can." Sophia narrowed her eyes, feeling a mix of anger and curiosity. "This isn't just random. People like you don't do things like this without a reason." James didn't answer. He simply gave a faint smile and stepped away. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, your transformation begins." Later that night, Sophia sat alone in her room, perched on the edge of the bed, as memories from her past began to resurface. It wasn't just the grandeur of the mansion that unsettled her. There was something deeper. She realized she had crossed paths with James before. Suddenly, a memory flashed in her mind. Years ago, sitting nervously in an interview room, she had dressed in her best outfit and clutched a meticulously prepared resume. The company, Carter Enterprises, and the interviewer, James Carter. She recalled James's cold gaze as he dismissed her with a harsh comment. "We don't waste time on amateurs." That humiliation had shattered her confidence. Her life had unraveled afterward, and now, ironically, she was married to the man who had triggered her downfall. Anger boiled inside her. How could he not remember her? Or did he remember and simply not care? Determined, Sophia left her room and went to the study where she found James reviewing documents. "I need to ask you something," she said, crossing her arms. James looked up, surprised by the interruption. "What is it?" "Do you really not remember me?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. James frowned, puzzled. "Should I?" Sophia clenched her fists, fighting back tears. "A few years ago, I came to your company looking for a job. You humiliated me in front of everyone." James studied her for a moment, as if trying to recall. Finally, he shrugged. "I interviewed dozens of people every month. I don't remember all of them." His indifference cut like a knife. "Of course you don't," she replied bitterly. "To you, we're all disposable." James remained silent, but something in Sophia's expression unsettled him. He stood and took a step toward her, but she was already walking away. Returning to her room, alone again, Sophia felt the weight of the situation. This wasn't just a cold arrangement. It was a chance to face the man who had once destroyed her. But she was no longer the vulnerable young woman from years ago. Hey, readers! What do you think of Sophia standing up to James? Smash that like button and comment truth if you're hooked on this drama. The next morning, Sophia awoke with the first rays of sunlight streaming through the massive windows. The weight of last night's conversation lingered, but she resolved not to let it consume her. She got up, took a shower, and went down for breakfast, where she found James already seated, reading a newspaper. "Good morning," she said in a neutral tone. James nodded, his eyes still on the paper. The silence between them was heavy, but Sophia refused to be intimidated. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. "So, what's next?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. James lowered the newspaper and looked at her with a faint smile. "Now your transformation begins. We have a team of stylists, etiquette instructors, and even a posture coach. Soon, you'll be introduced to high society as my wife." Sophia rolled her eyes. "As if expensive clothes will erase everything I've been through." James ignored the remark. "Next week's business dinner will be the first test. I need you to be flawless." The following days were grueling for Sophia. From early morning, she endured endless clothing fittings, etiquette lessons, and posture drills. Though she despised the superficiality of it all, she began to notice herself adapting to the new environment. James, meanwhile, kept his distance, but couldn't ignore the impact Sophia was having on the household. She wasn't like the other women he had known. She didn't bow to his authority. One afternoon, as Sophia practiced walking gracefully across the grand hall, James entered and watched in silence. When she noticed him, she stopped and crossed her arms. "Enjoying the show?" she asked with sarcasm. James gave a small smile. "Just assessing your progress. You're doing well." Sophia scoffed. "Glad my performance meets your approval, Mr. Carter." James stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. "Why does it always feel like you're ready to attack me?" "Maybe because you deserve it," she replied without hesitation. James paused, surprised by her honesty. Then he took a step back and changed the subject. "Get ready. We're going out tonight." "Where?" Sophia asked, suspicious. "A private dinner at a restaurant. I want to see how you handle yourself in public." Later that evening, James and Sophia arrived at one of the most upscale restaurants in the city. Sophia, wearing an elegant dress, drew admiring glances but felt uncomfortable under the attention. James, however, appeared completely at ease. During dinner, James noticed that Sophia was nervous. Her gaze shifted frequently, and she fidgeted with the strap of her dress. "Relax," he said in a low voice. "You're doing a great job." Sophia looked up, surprised by his encouraging tone. "I'm not used to any of this." James leaned forward slightly. "You'll adapt. Trust me." For a moment, Sophia saw something different in his eyes. He wasn't the cold, calculating man she'd met before. There was something more human, almost vulnerable. After dinner, on the ride back to the mansion, the atmosphere in the car was lighter. James commented on her behavior during dinner, pointing out small improvements she could make, but without his usual critical tone. "You're really taking this seriously, aren't you?" Sophia asked, curious. James glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "I always take my bets seriously." The mention of a bet made Sophia tense. She still didn't know exactly what James stood to gain from all this, but the idea of being just a pawn in some game left a bitter taste in her mouth. Later that night, while alone in her room, Sophia decided to explore the mansion. She wandered through the quiet hallways until she came across a slightly open door leading to an office. Inside, a massive wooden desk was covered with documents and papers. Curious, Sophia approached and began to look through the papers. Among contracts and financial reports, she found something that made her blood run cold. A printed conversation between James and another man discussing the details of the bet. "So, has she agreed?" One message read, "Yes, it's only a matter of time before I win," James's reply stated, the words dripping with indifference. Sophia felt her stomach churn. She'd known there was more to James's actions, but seeing the words in black and white made it all the more painful. Suddenly, the door opened, and James walked in. When he saw Sophia holding the papers, his expression hardened. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Sophia stared at him, clutching the papers tightly. "Is this how you see me? Just a bet to feed your ego?" James stepped closer, trying to take the papers, but Sophia pulled back. "Answer me," she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not as simple as it seems." "Not simple." Sophia let out a bitter laugh. "You've toyed with my life like I'm some disposable object." "Object, Sophia," James began, but she cut him off. "Don't you dare try to justify this," she shouted, throwing the papers onto the desk before storming out of the office. James stood alone, staring at the scattered papers. For the first time in years, he felt as though he'd lost control. Sophia could barely breathe as she rushed up the stairs, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. Once inside her room, she locked the door and leaned against it, trying to calm herself. Discovering the bet had shattered any tolerance she'd built over the past few days. "I can't stay here," she thought, as tears of anger and humiliation streamed down her face. She looked around desperately, searching for anything that could help her escape. That night, while everyone slept, Sophia put her plan into action. She dressed in simple clothes and packed a small bag with the few belongings she'd managed to gather since arriving at the mansion. Carefully, she opened the window, trying not to make a sound, and climbed down the trellis that held the mansion's rose vines. The cold night air enveloped her as she finally reached the ground. Sophia looked back at the mansion's imposing silhouette against the night sky. Part of her wanted to scream, to make James feel the pain she carried, but instead, she turned and ran toward the road without looking back. The streets were empty, and Sophia walked for hours, ignoring the exhaustion and the biting cold against her skin. When she finally reached the city center, she found shelter in a subway station, where she curled up on a bench and tried to sleep. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, James woke early and noticed Sophia's absence at breakfast. At first, he wasn't concerned, thinking she just needed space after the argument the night before. But when one of the staff mentioned they hadn't seen her since dinner, James felt a chill run down his spine. "Check her room," he ordered, trying to stay calm. A few minutes later, the butler returned with a worried expression. "Mr. Carter, the room is empty, and the window, it's open." James immediately ran upstairs and entered Sophia's room. The bed was untouched, and her clothes still hung in the closet. He walked to the window and saw marks on the trellis. "She ran away," he murmured, clenching his fists. Without wasting time, James grabbed his phone and made several calls, reaching out to his contacts to try to find her. The thought of Sophia wandering the streets alone unsettled him. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him was driving him to find her. Not because of the bet, but because of something new growing in his heart: regret. Meanwhile, Sophia wandered aimlessly, struggling to stay on her feet. Her strength was fading, and her fever was rising. The exhaustion of the past few days was catching up with her, but she refused to stop. Every step she took was a statement of her resilience, a proof that she wouldn't let James or any other man control her again. At dawn, Sophia reached a small square and sat on a wooden bench. Her hands trembled, and her vision blurred. She knew she needed help, but her pride kept her from asking. Closing her eyes, she felt her body give in to exhaustion. James, on the other hand, had already started searching the city streets, driving his own car. He scanned every corner, every bench, looking for any sign of Sophia. Guilt consumed him. He had never imagined his actions could cause so much pain. Hours later, with the sun high in the sky, he finally found her. Sophia was lying on a bench, curled up under a thin blanket someone had likely given her. Her face was pale, and she was trembling with fever. "Sophia!" James called out, running toward her. She slowly opened her eyes, her unfocused gaze meeting his. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here to take you home," he said, his voice firm but full of concern. "I don't have a home," she replied bitterly. James picked her up, ignoring her weak attempts to resist, and carried her to the car. On the way to the hospital, he remained silent, his thoughts a whirlwind. He knew he'd need more than words to regain Sophia's trust. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Sophia was dehydrated and running a high fever. James stayed by her side, watching her sleep as the medical staff cared for her. A heavy weight pressed on his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't in control of his own life. Hours later, when Sophia finally woke up, she found James sitting by her bed. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were fixed on her. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice still weak. "Because I care," James answered sincerely. Sophia let out a faint laugh, her voice a mere whisper. "You don't know what it means to care about anyone but yourself." James lowered his head, his hands gripping his knees. "Maybe you're right, but I'm trying to change." She watched him silently, unsure whether to believe him. Her mind was too tired to process his words. The next morning, Sophia woke to the soft sound of footsteps entering the room. Still weak, she turned her head slowly and saw a nurse adjusting her IV. The sight was comforting, but also a stark reminder of her vulnerability. James was nowhere to be seen, allowing her to relax a bit more. Not long after, the door opened and James walked in, carrying a small paper bag. He was dressed casually, a rare sight given his usual formal attire. His eyes showed fatigue, but also determination. "I brought something for you," he said, placing the bag on the bedside table. Sophia simply watched him without speaking. James pulled up a chair and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "It's soup. You need to regain your strength," he continued, opening the bag. "I don't want anything from you," Sophia replied, her voice hoarse and cold. James sighed but didn't push. He knew forcing anything now would be pointless. Instead, he stayed seated, letting the silence fill the room. "Why are you here, James?" Sophia finally asked, breaking the quiet. He hesitated before answering. "Because I care." Sophia let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know what that means." James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've spent my whole life not truly caring about anyone. But you made me see things I never wanted to face." She looked away, her hands gripping the bedsheet. "That doesn't change what you did." "I know," he said, his voice heavy. "And I don't expect you to forgive me anytime soon, but I'll prove that I can be different." Sophia remained silent, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She wanted to believe him, but the wounds were still too fresh. In the days that followed, James stayed by Sophia's side, ensuring she received all the care she needed. He coordinated with the doctors, made sure the food was to her liking, and even brought her books to help pass the time. Sophia, though still resentful, couldn't ignore his efforts. One afternoon, as she flipped through one of the books James had brought, she found something unexpected. A carefully folded letter tucked between the pages. It was handwritten in James's firm script. "Sophia, I know words aren't enough to undo what I've done, but I need you to know I'm trying. I've never been someone who admits mistakes, but you've made me look in the mirror and see who I really am. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want to become someone worthy of your respect. James." Sophia read the letter over and over, trying to decipher the intentions behind the words. Was there sincerity in them, or was this just another attempt to manipulate her? That night, when James walked into the room, Sophia held the letter up to him. "What is this?" she asked, her voice firm. James glanced at the letter inside. "It's my attempt to be honest." "Honest?" Sophia shook her head. "You used me, humiliated me. How can I believe anything you say?" James stepped closer, but kept a respectful distance. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but I'm here, and I'll stay here, even if it takes years for you to believe in me." Tears filled Sophia's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you." James nodded slowly. "I understand." The next day, the doctors informed Sophia she was well enough to leave the hospital. James wasted no time arranging everything to bring her back to the mansion. Sophia, though reluctant, knew she had nowhere else to go. When they arrived at the mansion, James surprised Sophia with something she never expected. He had transformed one of the rooms into a small art studio, complete with canvases, brushes, and paints in every color. "What is this?" she asked, stunned. "You mentioned once that you liked painting," James said with a shy smile. "I thought you might like a space of your own." Sophia was speechless. It was a simple gesture, but one filled with meaning. For the first time, she saw something in James beyond the arrogant billionaire. In the days that followed, Sophia began spending more time in the studio, exploring her creativity. Painting gave her a sense of freedom, something she hadn't felt in years. James, for his part, kept his distance, respecting her space while quietly ensuring her comfort. One afternoon, as Sophia painted, James appeared in the doorway, watching her in silence. "You're talented," he said at last. Sophia paused, looking at him. "I didn't know you had an eye for art." James shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm learning." She laughed for the first time in what felt like forever. The days at the mansion settled into a calmer rhythm. Sophia spent most of her time in the art studio, while James was occupied with his business affairs. There was a sort of truce between them, a fragile balance neither dared to disturb. But James wasn't satisfied. He knew words alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild Sophia's trust. He needed to take action to prove he was willing to change, not just for her, but for himself. One afternoon, James entered the studio while Sophia was focused on a new painting. He waited for her to notice him, but she kept working, deliberately ignoring him. "I need your help," he said finally, breaking the silence. Sophia stopped, wiping her hands on a cloth. "My help?" James nodded. "I want to start supporting social projects, and I think you can help me decide where to begin." She looked at him, skeptical. "Since when do you care about that?" "Since I realize the world doesn't revolve around me," he replied honestly. Sophia hesitated for a moment. Despite her reluctance to trust him, the idea of doing something meaningful appealed to her. "All right," she said at last, "but I'm not doing this for you." "I wouldn't expect anything else," James replied with a small smile. In the days that followed, James and Sophia began visiting charities and community projects. He took her to shelters, rehabilitation centers, and schools in underprivileged areas. During each visit, Sophia noticed how James interacted differently with people. He seemed genuinely interested in hearing their stories and understanding their needs. One visit was particularly impactful. They went to a shelter for women who had experienced domestic violence. While Sophia talked with some of the residents, James approached a young woman holding a baby. He crouched down to her level and began asking about her story. "It's hard to trust people after what I've been through," the young woman said, holding the baby tighter. James nodded, his expression serious. "I understand." Sophia, observing from a distance, was surprised. She hadn't expected James to show such genuine empathy. On the way home, the car ride was heavy with silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Sophia sensed that something was changing in James, though a barrier still remained, preventing her from fully believing in him. Who else is rooting for Sophia and James? Drop a hope in the comments and share this story with a friend who loves a good twist. One evening, James decided to take a bold step. He organized a special dinner, just for the two of them. The dining room was decorated with candles and flowers, and soft music played in the background. "What's this?" Sophia asked as she saw the table. "Thank you," James replied, pulling out a chair for her, "for helping me over the past few days." Sophia hesitated, but eventually sat down. The dinner was unlike any they had shared before. James was more open, sharing stories about his childhood and how he grew up in a cold environment where emotions were seen as weakness. "I think that's why I always used money as a shield," he admitted, staring at his wine glass. "It was easier than dealing with real people." Sophia listened in silence, absorbing every word. She had never imagined James admitting something like this. "And now?" she finally asked. "What do you want?" James looked up, locking eyes with her. "I want to be better, someone you might one day respect." She stayed quiet for a long moment before replying, "That doesn't depend only on you, James." "I know," he said with a sigh, "but I'll keep trying." After dinner, as James cleared the table, Sophia went to her studio and retrieved a small canvas she had painted in the past few days. It was a serene landscape, with an open field and a sunset sky. "Here," she said, handing the painting to James. He looked at the canvas, surprised. "It's beautiful." "I thought you might like it," Sophia replied with a shrug. James smiled, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Thank you." In the days that followed, James continued to show small changes in his behavior. He treated the mansion staff with more respect, listened to suggestions from his employees at the company, and dedicated more time to the social projects he and Sophia had started together. Sophia, in turn, began to lower her defenses, though cautiously. She knew trusting James again would be a long and complicated process. But little by little, something within her started to shift. One afternoon, as they walked through the mansion's garden, James suddenly stopped and looked at Sophia. "I want to show you something," he said. Curious, she followed him to a small cabin at the back of the property. When they entered, Sophia saw the place was filled with mementos from James's childhood. Photos, old toys, and even drawings he had made as a child. "I've never shown this to anyone," he said as she explored the space. Sophia picked up one of the photos and saw a young James next to an elegant woman who she assumed was his mother. "You had a different life than I imagined," she remarked. James gave a melancholic smile. "My mother always said money could buy many things, but never happiness. I think it took me a long time to understand that." Sophia placed the photo back on the shelf and turned to him. "Maybe there's still time to learn." The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, as Sophia walked slowly through the mansion's garden. The recent days had been intense, full of unexpected moments. She could feel something changing within herself, though there was still an immovable barrier keeping her from letting her guard down. That evening, James appeared in the art studio as Sophia finished a new painting. He looked hesitant, something unusual for the man who always exuded confidence. "May I come in?" he asked almost timidly. Sophia looked at him for a moment before nodding. James stepped in and approached her slowly, watching the canvas she was working on. "It's beautiful," he said, referring to the landscape she was painting. "Thank you," Sophia replied, keeping her focus on the painting. James took a deep breath before continuing. "I need to tell you something. Something I've never shared with anyone." Sophia set the brush down and turned to him, intrigued. "I'm listening." James began pacing the studio, his hands in his pockets, as though gathering courage. "When I was a kid, my mother was my only connection to the real world. My father was a cold man who believed success came before everything, even family. He taught me to be ruthless, to never show weakness." He paused for a moment, his eyes distant, lost in memories. "My mother, on the other hand, was the opposite. She believed love and empathy mattered more than any amount of money. But she died when I was only 12. After that, my father made sure I became the man he wanted me to be. Cold, calculating, and driven by numbers." Sophia listened intently, absorbing every word. There was something painfully human about the way he spoke of his past. "And now?" she asked gently. "Do you still think you need to be that man?" James shook his head slowly. "Number. You've shown me there's more to life than I was willing to see." A long silence followed before Sophia finally spoke. "I have something to say too." James looked at her curiously as Sophia lowered her gaze. "When you humiliated me in that interview years ago, it was the moment I lost all faith in myself. It broke me in ways you can't imagine." Her voice trembled, and James felt a crushing weight in his chest. He knew he had caused more harm than he could ever undo, but Sophia's honesty hit him like a blow. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even him. Sophia looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerable man, stripped of his usual arrogance. She knew forgiveness would be a long process, but at that moment, she decided to take the first step. "I want to believe you, James, but you need to understand that trust isn't rebuilt overnight." James nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." In the days that followed, James threw himself even more into social projects. He and Sophia worked together, visiting underserved communities and speaking with people who had faced challenges similar to Sophia's. With each interaction, Sophia began to see that James truly was changing. During one of these visits, they met a young woman named Ava, who was about to drop out of school due to financial difficulties. Sophia, moved by her story, decided to act. "James, can we help?" she asked, determination in her eyes. James smiled. "We can, and we will." With James's support, Ava received a scholarship and financial assistance. Sophia felt a warmth in her heart as she saw the joy in the young woman's eyes. It was as if, by helping her, Sophia was also healing herself a little more. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Sophia sat in the living room, watching the fire crackle in the fireplace. James entered and sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Today was special," he said, breaking the silence. Sophia nodded. Yes, it was. They sat quietly for a moment before James spoke again. "Sophia, can I ask you something?" She looked at him, waiting. "Do you think there's still a chance for us?" Sophia felt her heart race. It was a difficult question, but she knew she had to be honest. "I don't know, James. I think we still have a lot to work through." James nodded, accepting her answer without protest. He knew that if there was any hope, he would have to keep proving to her that he was willing to change. The days passed slowly, but life at James's mansion began to find a rhythm. Sophia became more and more involved in the social projects, and James continued to show small but meaningful changes in his behavior. Though the emotional distance between them began to narrow, Sophia was still hesitant to fully trust him. One sunny afternoon, James invited Sophia to take a walk in the garden. She hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. As they strolled among the flowers, James spoke about a new project, building a community center to provide education and job training for people in vulnerable situations. "I want you to lead it with me," he said, smiling encouragingly. Sophia stopped, surprised. "Me?" "Yes. You understand these people's needs better than anyone, and I want you to know that I trust you." She stayed silent for a moment, taking in his words. Despite a lingering shadow of doubt, Sophia couldn't ignore the warmth growing in her heart. "I'll think about it," she finally replied. James nodded, respecting her need for time. Later that day, while Sophia was in the art studio, she received an unexpected call. It was from Mia, an old friend from her time on the streets. Mia's voice, full of emotion, stirred a mix of nostalgia and joy in Sophia. "Sophia, I heard you're doing well now and working on social projects. I need to see you," Mia said, almost breathless. Sophia arranged to meet her at a cafe downtown the following day. When she told James about the meeting, he insisted on accompanying her. "I won't interfere, but I want to make sure you're safe," he said seriously. Sophia rolled her eyes, but accepted his offer. The next day, as she waited for Mia at the cafe, Sophia felt a tinge of nervousness. It had been years since they last met, and she didn't know what to expect. When Mia finally arrived, the two embraced warmly, reminiscing about the hard times they had shared. "You've changed, Sophia," Mia remarked after a few moments of conversation. "You seem stronger." "I'm still learning," Sophia replied with a modest smile. As they talked, Sophia noticed James sitting discreetly at a nearby table. Though he was there solely to ensure her safety, his presence brought her an unexpected sense of comfort. On the drive back to the mansion, Sophia broke the silence. "Thank you for bringing me here today." James smiled, surprised by her sudden gratitude. "There's no need to thank me." "But I want to," she insisted. "You've been different, and I've noticed." James was quiet for a moment before responding. "I just want to do the right thing, Sophia." The sincerity in his voice made Sophia's heart waver. Though she wanted to deny it, She couldn't ignore that James was indeed changing. Let's play a little game. For those who read the comments, type Coca-Cola in the comments. Only those who get to this point will understand. Now, let's continue the story. However, things took a turn when Ethan, the friend who had proposed the bet, reappeared unexpectedly. He showed up at the mansion unannounced, a cynical smile on his face. "James, how's it going with your new wife?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Sophia, who was in the garden, froze when she heard his voice. She decided to quietly approach and hide behind a column to listen. "What do you want, Ethan?" James asked, clearly irritated. "Oh, I'm just curious. After all, the bet's almost up, isn't it? You must be looking forward to collecting your $2 million. Sophia felt a chill run through her. She knew about the bet, but hearing Ethan speak about it so carelessly reopened old wounds she was trying to heal. "The bet doesn't matter anymore," James replied firmly. "I canceled it." Ethan laughed, disbelieving. "Canceled? You've got to be kidding." "I'm not," James said, his tone serious. "I don't need the money, and I definitely don't need the bet." Ethan looked at him, surprised. "So, you're really falling for her?" James didn't respond, but his expression said it all. Sophia stepped out from her hiding spot, her heart torn between anger and confusion. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. James turned, startled to see her. "Sophia, I can explain." "I don't want explanations, James. I want the truth," she shouted, tears filling her eyes. Ethan, sensing the tension, stepped back uncomfortably. "I think I'll leave you two to sort this out." As he left, James tried to approach Sophia, but she backed away. "Did you cancel the bet?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Yes, I did." "Why?" James took a deep breath. "Because you're more important than any stupid challenge." Sophia stood silent, her emotions in turmoil. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt again was overwhelming. "I don't know if I can trust you, James. Not after all this," she finally said. "Then don't trust me," he replied, his tone calm yet firm. "Just watch. Let my actions prove what my words can't." Sophia looked at him, trying to decipher the sincerity in his eyes. Though doubts lingered, something inside her told her he was being truthful. The days following Sophia and James's confrontation were tense. Sophia spent hours in the studio, trying to sort through her thoughts, while James remained determined to prove his intentions were genuine. Despite the distance that still existed between them, it was impossible to ignore the visible transformation in James. That morning, Sophia sat on the terrace with a cup of tea, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. Her restless mind wandered between painful memories of the past and recent moments of genuine connection with James. She knew she had to make a decision soon, but the fear of trusting again left her paralyzed. James appeared in the doorway, hesitant. He held a folder in his hands, his expression serious, but lacking the arrogance she had once associated with him. "May I join you?" he asked, respecting the space she so deeply valued. Sophia nodded, and James sat at the table, placing the folder between them. "I brought something for you," he said, opening the folder and carefully taking out a set of documents. "This is proof that I ended the bet. There's no longer any connection between me and Ethan." Sophia picked up the papers and read them carefully. The signatures and dates confirmed that James had indeed returned the money from the bet and had even donated a significant amount to charity. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because I want you to know I'm being honest. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I want you to see that I'm trying to be a different man." Sophia set the papers aside and turned her gaze back to the horizon. She knew James was making an effort, but the wound from his betrayal still ached. "You want to be different, but that doesn't change what happened," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It doesn't," James admitted, leaning forward slightly. But I want you to know I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." The silence between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Sophia knew that sooner or later, she would have to confront her own feelings about James. In the days that followed, James continued to respect Sophia's space, while also demonstrating his change through concrete actions. He became deeply involved in social projects, visiting communities, and listening to the stories of those who were benefiting from the initiatives. Sophia, though still cautious, couldn't help but notice his genuine dedication. One afternoon, while they were visiting a shelter for at-risk youth, a teenage girl named Lily caught Sophia's attention. The 16-year-old was pregnant and overwhelmed with hopelessness. "I don't know how I'm going to take care of my baby," Lily confessed, tears streaming down her face. Sophia's heart ached. She sat beside the girl and held her hand. "You're not alone. We'll help you find a way." James watched from a distance, admiring the way Sophia connected with people. After that visit, he decided it was time to take an important step. That evening, he arranged a special dinner at the mansion, just for the two of them. The dining room was decorated with candles and flowers, and soft music played in the background. When Sophia walked in, she paused, surprised by the warm and inviting atmosphere. "What is this?" she asked, looking at James, who stood by the table. "A way to thank you for everything you've been doing," he replied, pulling out a chair for her. Reluctantly, Sophia sat down, watching James's every move. He seemed more vulnerable than ever, but also more determined. The dinner began in silence, but gradually, James started to open up. He shared stories about his childhood, the challenges of growing up under the shadow of a strict father, and how the loss of his mother had shaped him. "I used money as a way to avoid pain," he admitted, looking directly at Sophia. "But I see now that it turned me into someone I don't want to be." Sophia listened intently, torn between empathy and skepticism. She could tell James was being sincere, but she wasn't sure if she could fully trust him yet. "I want to believe you, James," she said finally. "But there's still a part of me that's afraid." James nodded, accepting her words without argument. "And I'll keep trying. I'm not going to give up on proving I'm worthy of your trust." After dinner, James walked Sophia to her art studio. Before saying goodnight, he pulled something from his pocket, a small silver butterfly pendant. "My mom gave this to me when I was a child," he said, holding out the pendant to Sophia. "She used to say that butterflies symbolize transformation. I want you to have it as a reminder that we all have the ability to change." Sophia took the pendant, feeling the symbolic weight of the gift. For a moment, she was speechless, but then she looked at James and gave him a faint smile. "Thank you," she said softly. In the days that followed, Sophia began to notice small changes within herself. Although she still kept some distance from James, moments of connection started to happen naturally. A casual conversation in the garden, a glance exchanged during a meeting. These small gestures showed that the barrier between them was beginning to fade. One afternoon, while walking through the garden, James suddenly stopped and looked at Sophia. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to a small cabin at the back of the property. When they stepped inside, Sophia was surprised to see that the cabin was filled with mementos from James's childhood. Photos, old toys, and even letters he had written to his mother as a child. "This was my refuge," James explained with a nostalgic smile. Sophia picked up one of the letters and read it silently. In it, a young James wrote about his dreams and fears, revealing a vulnerable side she had never imagined. "You really are changing," she said, placing the letter back on the shelf. James looked at her, his eyes filled with hope. "I'm trying, for you." Sophia stayed quiet for a moment before responding, "Maybe there's still a chance for us." The days following their visit to James's cabin were marked by introspection and hesitation. Sophia knew she was nearing a crucial decision, but her fear of being hurt again made her hold back. James, on the other hand, seemed increasingly certain of his commitment. He didn't pressure Sophia, but made a point of being present, showing that he was willing to face any challenge to prove his transformation. One evening, while Sophia was in the studio finishing a painting, James appeared at the door. He held 2 glasses of wine and seemed more relaxed than usual. "May I come in?" he asked with a slight smile. Sophia nodded, and he approached, handing her one of the glasses. They stood in silence for a moment, observing the painting Sophia was working on. It was a portrait of a butterfly perched on a flower, its vibrant colors standing out against the soft background. "It's beautiful," James said sincerely. "Thank you," Sophia replied with a small smile. James took a sip of wine before speaking again. "You know, the transformation of a butterfly has always fascinated me. It starts as something so small and limited, but over time, it becomes something entirely different." Sophia glanced at him, recognizing the parallel he was trying to draw. "And you believe people can change like that?" "I believe they can if they truly want to," he replied firmly. She stayed silent, processing his words. Despite her lingering doubts, Sophia couldn't deny that James was different. The next morning, James announced he'd planned a trip. "I want to show you something special," he said mysteriously. Sophia hesitated, but eventually agreed. A private plane took them to a small village in the mountains, a peaceful place surrounded by breathtaking landscapes. Upon arrival, James led her to a simple, yet cozy house he had prepared especially for the occasion. "Why did you bring me here?" Sophia asked, intrigued. James looked around, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. "This place reminds me of how life can be simple, and yet so full of meaning. I wanted us to have a moment away from everything so we can truly connect." During their time there, Sophia and James shared moments that once seemed impossible. They walked together on trails, cooked simple meals, and talked about their lives, hopes, and fears. Sophia began to see a side of James he had hidden for so long, a human, vulnerable side that deeply moved her. On one of these walks, as they rested by a lakeside, James broke the silence. "Sophia, I know I still have a lot to prove to you, but I want you to know that, no matter what happens, this change in me is real." She looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "And what do you want from me, James?" "Just a chance," he replied simply. Sophia felt a lump in her throat. For so long, she had built walls around her heart, but now, standing before James, those walls were beginning to crumble. When they returned to the mansion, Sophia felt different. There was a clarity in her thoughts that she hadn't had before, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could trust James again. Still, she knew the final decision needed to be made carefully. Are you feeling the tension between Sophia and James? Hit like and comment "change" if you think James deserves a second chance. The morning air was crisp and fresh, and the soft sunlight was beginning to brighten the mansion. Sophia woke slowly, the golden rays slipping through the partially open curtains. Sitting up in bed, she looked around, taking in the peaceful silence that enveloped the house. Something inside her had shifted over the past few days. The confusion that had haunted her for so long was starting to lift. After their trip to the mountains, Sophia felt as though the walls she'd built around her heart were finally coming down. She remembered every moment she'd shared with James, the deep conversations, the spontaneous laughter, and the constant care he had shown. All of it pointed to a truth she was afraid to admit. James had truly changed, and she could no longer deny the impact he was having on her life. Sophia went downstairs for breakfast and found James at the table. He greeted her with a warm smile, setting aside the newspaper as soon as he saw her. "Good morning," he said in the gentle tone that had become so common lately. "Good morning," Sophia replied, sitting across from him. The silence between them was comfortable. James poured her a cup of coffee, watching as she took her first sip. He could sense something had changed, but didn't want to push her. After breakfast, James suggested they take a walk in the garden. Sophia agreed, and together they strolled along the flower-lined path. The quiet was filled with the songs of birds and the soft rustle of trees in the breeze. When they reached a small stone bench under an old tree, James stopped and turned to face her. "Sophia, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice serious. She looked at him, waiting. "A while ago, I promised I'd do everything I could to earn back your trust. I need to know, have I made any progress?" Sophia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his question. She met his gaze, noticing the hope and vulnerability in his eyes. "You've changed, James," she admitted. "And yes, you're earning my trust back." James smiled, but there was something else he needed to say. "Then, I have another question," he said, lowering himself to one knee and pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Sophia gasped, surprised, as James opened the box to reveal a simple, yet elegant diamond ring. "Sophia Lane, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because of a contract, but because of love." His words hung in the air, and Sophia felt tears well up in her eyes. For a moment, she was speechless, her heart racing. Finally, she smiled and nodded. "Yes, James, I will." James slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced under the shade of the tree. It was a simple moment, yet profoundly meaningful, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The wedding took place just a few weeks later in an intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden. Only a few close friends and partners from their social projects were present, but the love and joy in the air were undeniable. Sophia wore a light lace dress that made her look almost ethereal, while James, in a sharp suit, couldn't take his eyes off her. During their vows, James held Sophia's hands tightly, his voice filled with emotion. "Sophia, you've taught me the true meaning of love, patience, and redemption. I promise to stand by your side through every moment, good or bad, and dedicate my life to making you happy." With tears in her eyes, Sophia responded, "James, you've shown me that people can change, and that love can grow even in the most unlikely circumstances. I promise to love you and walk by your side as we build our future together." The applause and smiles from their guests followed their kiss, sealing their commitment to one another. For the first time, Sophia felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. Their first year of marriage was full of challenges, but also moments of joy and growth. Together, Sophia and James worked to expand their social projects, helping hundreds of people rebuild their lives. Their relationship deepened, rooted in trust and genuine love. One morning, as they were in the kitchen preparing breakfast together, Sophia turned to James with a shy smile. "I have some news for you," she said, her eyes sparkling. Curious, James stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "What is it?" "We're going to have a baby," Sophia revealed, her voice filled with emotion. For a moment, James was speechless, but soon a radiant smile lit up his face. He stepped closer and embraced her tightly. "This is wonderful, Sophia," he exclaimed, his voice filled with emotion. The news brought even more joy to their lives, and the following months were spent preparing the baby's room and planning for their future as a family. The day Olivia Carter was born was one of the most emotional moments in Sophia and James's lives. When they finally held their daughter in their arms, both felt an instant connection, as if all the challenges of the past had prepared them for that moment. "She's perfect," Sophia whispered, tears in her eyes. "Just like her mother," James replied, gently stroking Olivia's head. Olivia's arrival further strengthened the bond between them, and the mansion, once marked by coldness and formality, became a warm, loving home. The following years were filled with achievements. The community center that James and Sophia had founded became a beacon of hope, helping thousands of people find new opportunities. Sophia continued painting, using her art to raise funds for social projects, while James became a mentor to young entrepreneurs aiming to make a difference. Olivia grew up surrounded by love, her laughter filling the house with joy. James and Sophia, now partners in every sense of the word, look to the future with hope and gratitude. One evening, as they watched Olivia sleep, James held Sophia's hand and whispered, "You've changed my life in ways I never imagined." Sophia smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you've shown me that love can bloom in the most unexpected places." Together, they looked ahead, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would always stand by each other, united by the love that transformed them. When I first dove into the story of James Carter and Sophia Lane, I couldn't help but feel a whirlwind of emotions: skepticism, curiosity, and eventually, a surprising sense of hope. It's a tale that starts with a premise straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster. A cocky millionaire bets he can transform a struggling woman off the streets into a polished, high-society wife. On the surface, it sounds like a shallow game of power and pride, something you'd expect from a guy like James, who's built his life on wealth and control. But as the layers peeled back, what struck me wasn't the glitz of the mansion or the audacity of the bet. It was the raw, messy journey of two flawed people, finding their way to something real. Sophia, with her quiet strength and scars from a tough past, and James, with his cold exterior, hiding a man desperate to rewrite his story, became more than just characters. They turned into mirrors reflecting parts of ourselves we don't always want to face: our mistakes, our walls, and our longing for second chances. What hit me hardest was Sophia's resilience. Here's a woman who's been knocked down by life, humiliated by James years ago in a job interview, left with nothing but a cardboard sign and a plastic cup. Yet, she doesn't let that define her. When James swoops in with his outrageous proposal, she doesn't just jump at the money. She questions him, pushes back, and holds on to her dignity, even when her stomach's growling and the cold's biting at her skin. That's grit, the kind of tenacity Americans admire in our heroes, from pioneers to everyday folks clawing their way up. It's the underdog spirit we root for in movies like Rocky, or cheer for in real-life stories of people who refuse to stay down. Sophia's not perfect. She's bitter, guarded, and slow to trust. But that's what makes her relatable. She's us when we've been burned and aren't sure if we can open up again. Then there's James, the guy I wanted to hate. He starts off as the stereotype of a rich jerk, arrogant, detached, treating people like chess pieces. But the story doesn't let him off easy. When Sophia calls him out, when she finds proof of the bet and runs, you see the cracks in his armor. He's not just a villain. He's a man shaped by a cold father and a lost mother, someone who's used money as a shield because he never learned how to feel. His transformation isn't instant or fairy tale perfect. It's slow, messy, and full of stumbles. He tracks Sophia down not to win the bet, but because he's starting to care, and that shift feels real. It's the kind of redemption arc we love in American culture, where someone owns their screw-ups and fights to be better, like a modern-day Ebenezer Scrooge waking up to a new day. The big takeaway for me, and maybe for anyone reading this, is about trust and change. Sophia's journey teaches us that it's okay to guard your heart when you've been hurt, but it's also worth taking a risk when someone shows they're genuinely trying. She doesn't forgive James overnight. She makes him prove it, step by step, through actions, not just words. That's a lesson I can apply to my own life. How many times have I written someone off because of a single mistake, refusing to see if they could grow? Maybe it's a friend who let me down or a coworker who messed up. Sophia reminds me to look for the effort, to give people a shot at redemption if they're willing to put in the work. It's not about being naive. It's about recognizing that people, like James, can evolve when they're pushed to confront who they've been. James, on the other hand, shows that change starts from within. He didn't turn into a saint, because Sophia demanded it. He did it because her presence forced him to look in the mirror. That's powerful. In my own life, I've had moments where I've coasted, leaning on habits or excuses instead of challenging myself to be better. Maybe it's skipping the gym, procrastinating on a project, or avoiding a tough conversation. James's story nudges me to ask, what's my bet? What am I hiding behind that keeps me from growing? For him, it was money and pride. For me, it might be fear of failure or just plain laziness. His shift, from a guy who saw Sophia as a pawn to someone who built her an art studio and canceled the bet, tells me that real change isn't about grand gestures. It's about consistent, quiet choices to do the right thing, even when no one's watching. Their relationship also hammers home the idea that love isn't a straight line. It's not all roses and violins. It's arguments, doubts, and hard-won trust. In American culture, we're fed this idea of instant soulmates. But Sophia and James show a grittier truth. Love can grow from ashes if both people are willing to dig in. I can take that into my own relationships, whether it's with a partner, family, or friends. Instead of expecting perfection, I can focus on building something real, step by step, even when it's messy. It's about showing up, like James did at the hospital, or opening up, like Sophia did with that painting she gave him. So, what's the life lesson here? It's about giving and earning second chances. For Sophia, it's learning to trust again without losing herself. For James, it's proving that who you were doesn't have to be who you are. In my life, I can apply that by being more patient with others and tougher on myself. Not in a harsh way, but in a way that pushes me to grow. Next time someone apologizes, I'll look at their actions, not just their words. And when I mess up, I'll take a page from James's book. Own it, fix it, and keep moving forward. It's a balance of grace and grit, a combo that feels so American, believing in comebacks while holding people accountable. This story isn't just a tearjerker, it's a roadmap for navigating the messy, beautiful reality of being human. So, what did you think of Sophia and James's journey? Did it hit you in the feels or make you rethink second chances? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. If this story moved you, smash that like button, share it with your crew, and hit subscribe so you don't miss our next emotional roller coaster. Ring that bell for updates, and check out more heart-tugging tales on the end screen. Let's keep the conversation going. See you in the comments.